Good morning. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming to the panel, Closing the Gender Divide in Low and Middle Income Countries. We're very happy to have you here. First of all, I would really like to thank Rob and Jess for setting up this amazing event. Thank you so much for organizing this. Secondly, I'd really like to thank the partners, which is Wheeler Institute, Africa, LBS Africa Business Club, Women in Business Club, Saïd Business School, and Judge Business School for partnering. My name is Iris Steenkamp. I'm a PhD student at LBS. I'll be your moderator for today. I'm your moderator because my research actually focuses a lot on gender empowerment in low and middle income countries, in particularly looking at economics. And what I mean with that is the role of employment in empowering women. So before we dive in and we introduce our three amazing panelists, I'll give you a very brief macro overview of why we're having this panel. So at the current rate, the global gender gap will not close for another 136 years, despite many commitments from many amazing partners to reach gender equality. One of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the process has been very, very slow. And the recent COVID lockdown and pandemic has really even slowed down the rate of progress that we had. Gender inequality, we see many, many dimensions. Unfortunately, we can't cover all of it now, but I'll just highlight a few, basically to support why we're having this panel. First of all, labor force participation. What we see is that only 47% of women versus 74% of men are in the global labor force. Women face many barriers enrolling the labor force, or even when they're in the labor force, such as lower payments. But this has very serious implication. Women between 25 to 34 are on average 25% more likely than men to live in extreme poverty. As partly associated with this lower labor force participation, we actually see that women experience lower agency compared to men in many parts in low and middle income countries. They have less control, for example, about making their own choices, control about their own life, accessing education, but also they have less input in household decision-making, resulting often in lower life satisfaction. But also at an institutional level, we see that women are less able to access opportunities, whether it's in employment, entrepreneurship, education, or politics. This can be driven through many things, such as social norms, pressure to get married early, but also the pressure to actually take care of household work, the big unpaid domestic household burden that often falls on women. There are many more dimensions in which we see gender inequality, whether it's from healthcare to technology to education and beyond. Our panelists will talk a lot about this. But before we go in there, I just wanted to highlight again the importance of closing gender inequality. At a micro level, what we see, for example, many benefits, but one of them is that we see is if women are more empowered, we actually see direct benefits on the children, often through higher investments in education or, for example, in health. But also on a macro level, the impact that actually closing the gender gap, and particularly actually equaling labor force participation between men and women, is tremendous. McKinsey estimated that it could add $12 trillion to the global GDP. So it's urgent, and it's very critical that we actually start building systems, whether it's from political, economic, healthcare, in which we really focus on strengthening the power of women. And in that, what we see is we have different stakeholders, and these different stakeholders are working together. And that is also one of the key things that we'll be learning from our panelists today. So without much ado, I'm really delighted to introduce to you our amazing panelists. Yasmin, would you first want to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and it's really just such a pleasure to be here. So my name is Yasmin Madan. I'm a director of programs at Co-Impact, which is a collaborative philanthropy. And prior to joining Co-Impact, I spent about 20 years in health systems in public and private sector. And I've been really fortunate to have worked and lived in different parts of the world, in India, Zimbabwe, Vietnam, Cambodia, and now in the US, and gained a bit of perspective on how societies and systems work. And for me, this topic is really personal. I was born and spent a major part of my life in India and grew up just surrounded by deeply entrenched gender norms. What I could do, who I could be, how I could live my life was all informed by what society thought women should do and could do. And it can be extremely restrictive, extremely unfulfilling and limiting to have your life's aspirations managed by gendered expectations. So thanks to this, I've come to believe that we really can't keep holding back half the population of the world. It has benefits, but it's the right thing to do. And societies, systems, countries work better when everyone can have fulfilling lives. So I'm really excited for the conversation. Thank you, Iris.
Thank you, Jasmine. Doreen, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, hi, my name is Doreen Deshavanti. I'm currently the Chief of Staff and Director of Government Relations at Waneka Fund in Rwanda. And Waneka Fund is a social enterprise that delivers financing, training, and agricultural inputs to farmers in Eastern and Southern Africa. Prior to joining Waneka Fund, a lot of my work and interest areas were around rule of law systems, but also particularly gender education for girls. So I served in the US Peace Corps and lived in a community in Belize where on average, girls would get married off between the ages of 14 and 16. And I was working on a community health project, but we were seeing we're seeing a direct correlation between some of the outcomes for children under the age of 5 and the ages of the mothers. So I've been fortunate enough to work on issues of gender equality across the health and education sector and now agriculture as well. So I'm really, really excited to be a part of this conversation today.
Thank you, Doreen. Manjira, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hello all, I hope you can hear me okay. Glorious technological challenges as usual. Hi, greetings from Nairobi. My name is Manjira. Simply put, I follow, among other things, the gendered implications of ICT adoption across sectors, across societies. I come at it from a perspective of having been born, raised, struggling with internet connectivity in the global south, if you will. So having that sort of lived experience, but also working from this sort of global level, as I like to call it. Often, sometimes when we get into these conversations about developing countries, the perspectives that are coming from that, there's such a lens that is placed around how we can speak to things, what we can speak to, a particular narrative of almost a rags to riches dimension sort of takes up. So I also work a lot on challenging the notion of who contributes to what is considered a global or international perspective to things. And I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much. And thank you again on behalf of all of us for joining this panel. I'm really looking forward to it. So let's dive in. As we already all mentioned, gender inequality is experienced across many dimensions. And as the first question, we'd really like to understand a little bit more, what is your experience? What have you been focusing on in terms of gender empowerment and closing the gender gap? As well as, what are effective actions? So, Yasmin, my first question is to you. Going back is trying to change the way that actually funders think about actually creating a sustainable impact by including the gender lens. What do you see as one of the main priorities in actually first closing this gender gap? And why do you believe it's so essential for philanthropy to take this mindset and focus so prominently on gender inequality?
Thank you. So just to explain, Co-Impact is a donor collaborative. So on one hand, we bring funders together to pool their resources and make large-scale long-term investments. And on the other hand, we use these investments to make systems that provide the most basic services of health, education, economic opportunity more effective. And the first point I want to make is no matter what philanthropy spends, it can never match the resources that the government has. So when I talk about government resources, I mean the infrastructure, the workforce, public financing mechanisms, and the policies and mandates that determine how these resources get deployed. So the best use of philanthropic dollar is to make government and where relevant private resources effective and inclusive. But today, these systems are not designed to be equitable or inclusive. If we look at outcomes across the board, outcomes in health, education, economic opportunity, they're all gender inequitable. Women and girls have worse outcomes than men and boys, and even worse when overlapping discrimination like race, class, caste are added to these. To give an example, and you started us there, Iris, in the labor force participation in South Asia has stagnated, and in places like India, it's actually gone backwards. So governments are spending billions and billions of dollars, but their systems are not working for half the population. So at Co-Impact, we're really trying to say, how do you change the gravitational pull of these systems towards gender equality? How these basic services are provided, how do you do that effectively and equitably? And it certainly requires technocratic solutions, no doubt, but it's all about understanding who has power, who makes decisions, whose voice is included, who's at the table, and who sets these rules of the game. And that's really core. So that's one part. The second is, and again, you mentioned this, Iris, with COVID, we've seen these fault lines in the system more glaringly than ever before, and women and girls are just falling through the cracks of these fault lines. Increased number of women are leaving the workforce, higher rates of violence than we've heard, restrictive reproductive rights, significantly increased burden of unpaid care, lack of policies and mandates for childcare, and the crisis, this toll this crisis took on unemployment and employment in informal sector, where you don't have legal rights, social protection. So each of these is context-based, but there are some common themes emerging around the world. And the reason the response has been inadequate is because who's in charge? Even today, women are a very small portion of the leadership positions, and their priorities and needs are not getting reflected in these national agendas. So for us, systems change is about leadership, it's power dynamics, it's inclusion, and it's deeply understanding these structural barriers and then realigning public and private resources, right? So that the outcomes, when we say systems are about better outcomes, we can't say that. It has to be better outcomes for all. If the system works for that last mile, it's going to work for the first 100. So for us at Co-Impact, it's about this. It's about realigning public resources towards gender equality to get better outcomes for all.
Wonderful, thank you, Yasmin. Could you give us an example of basically working together with a government or a funding organization that has been really effective?
Yeah, absolutely. We have an organization in India we partner with, the Foundation for Ecological Security, that works on restoring ecological restoration and then economic rights of the commons. These are forests, pastures, water bodies that are commonly used, and about 200 plus million people depend on it. Today, they're reaching 16 million, and they plan to more than double their impact there. But what we saw was in these places, where 73% of the rural women are farmers, less than 50% or 15% own their land. 2/3 of the livestock keepers are women, but they're left completely out of the pasture land management. And women's participation in the local governance institutions is limited. They don't have a say on how government and community resources are allocated, and just a general lack of gender disaggregated data, and technology is blind. So you can't solve a problem you can't see. And what our partner organization, Foundation for Ecological Security, is doing is looking at bringing gender to the core of how these government resources get allocated. Plus, they're ensuring about 30,000 women leaders in local governance institutions will have voice, agency, and power in the management and the governance of the commons. Plus, they're bringing gender, because you can't see the change you don't reflect within their organization, at the leadership level, within their board. Similarly, we're going to have Doreen talk about what One Acre Fund is doing, another partner, where they're looking at, majority of the smallholder farmers are women. And again, you have issues of limited access to inputs, limited resources, limited access to markets, and it all starts with limited decision making at the household level. And our partners looking at addressing that.
Thank you, Yasmin. It's often indeed that women, particularly if they have a lot of the burden of taking care of the livestock falls on them, but they don't own the livestock. Neither do they have actually the agency over the income that they earn from that. But you actually made a great bridge to Doreen. Doreen, as part of 1 Acre Fund, you really focus on agriculture because when we look at economic empowerment of women, agriculture plays such a big role. And particularly what 1 Acre Fund focuses on is providing access, training, inputs, etc. Mainly 70%, if I'm correct, female customers. Can you elaborate a little bit on the challenges that some of your female clients face? And why smallholder agriculture and access to credit is so important?
Yeah, thanks, Aris. So in the last 10 years, 1 Acre Fund has learned firsthand that gender equality can be very multidimensional. And I think someone had mentioned that, in that women's participation does not actually necessarily translate into equality. So we are actually partnering with Co-Impact. And last year we ran a gender audit of a program to really understand the status quo of women farmers in the program, and to also start understanding the opportunities for us to add a more intentional gender lens to our programmatic work. And that assessment identified a couple pain points that women farmers face, and I'll highlight a few of them. One is household decision making. For example, in Rwanda, we found that women have significantly less control over major household decisions, from what inputs to purchase, market decisions, or use of post-market incomes than men. And that constrains their role both in investment and consumption. Another finding was just the lack of information, with women being severely underrepresented in key groups and activities, such as agricultural cooperatives that train farmers on boosting agricultural productivity or accessing land rights. We found that women have significant time poverty relative to men, with women typically spending more time on unpaid care work. I think Yasmin mentioned that, which dramatically limits their earning potential. In Rwanda, for example, women are spending 5 hours per day on unpaid care work, versus men who are only spending about an hour and a half. And then lastly, we were looking at this also from a land perspective. We also found that within many African countries, we lacked legal frameworks that explicitly promote gender equal outcomes for women's land rights. And the reason why this is important, the World Bank predicts that by 2030, 9 out of 10 of the world's most extreme poor are going to live in sub-Saharan Africa. The majority are going to live in rural areas where farming predominates. And this poverty is going to disproportionately affect women. So we know that one key root cause of farm poverty is inequitable gender norms. And we've also seen that in other parts of the world, agricultural growth has not always been gender equitable, and women have an equal access to, every agricultural service and productivity factor you can think of, whether it's access to financing or agricultural inputs. In sub-Saharan Africa, smallholder women produce 13 to 25% less than men per acre. But what we also know is that once women have equal access to these productivity factors, they are actually able, to compete with men, and they're no longer disproportionately poor. So at 1 Acre Fund, we see an opportunity to really help shape a gender equitable agriculture system that is both pro-poor for farmers, but also pro-women, and one that really levels the playing field for women. And we really hope that by doing this, we can actually start making, a dent in, responding and to extreme global poverty, because as someone mentioned, I believe it was Yasmin, we are not going to make as much progress if we leave women behind.
Thank you, Doreen. You raise a very important point that just access to finance or employment or entrepreneurship doesn't necessarily mean empowerment. Actually, my research really focuses on what elements can foster empowerment. But what we would like to learn a bit more from you, Doreen, is do you have a very concrete example or can you demonstrate a little bit more what actually, for the farmers that you've seen, the access to finance can lead to benefits? What does it add for women?
Yeah, I'll start by saying that particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, this is the most gender unequal region in the world where, according, I believe it's like a 2016 UNDP report, African women are only achieving 87% of the human development outcomes of men. And this gender gap to finance is even greater in rural areas where women are often, on average, less educated. They spend more time on unpaid work, and they're also more likely to have, other cultural constraints that limit both their agency and mobility. And what this translates into is lower levels of agriculture productivity because women are going to have issues accessing productive land or financial services or extension services, which they need, which is necessary for them to achieve better yields. On the other hand, we see the impact of financial inclusion, both on communities, but also on women as individuals. We've seen that greater financial independence for women is often tied to increased spending on, health and education. We've seen that financial empowerment of women drives improvements in their decision-making. But if we're to be practical, I was thinking actually, as you were asking me that question, of a particular story of a farmer in a program in Uganda. Her name's Jessica. She took a loan from One Acre Fund. With that loan, with access to credit, she was able to quadruple her farm's productivity. She was able to build a thriving poultry business. In addition to comfortably supporting a family of 10 children, she was able to use the profits to send 2 of her kids to university. And this really speaks to the power of financial inclusion in empowering women to make more independent decisions, both for them as individuals, but also for their families as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Doreen. Nigeria, your work really focuses at the intersection between digital technology, civic engagement, and policy. And you really focus in this also on the gender element. Can you tell us what you currently see as the major problems with the gender divide in digital and technology?
I mean, it's really what Yasmin and Doreen have talked about, just ported to a new paradigm, which is digital. And the biggest misconception around technologies is that they are deployed and designed in a vacuum, and so long as you avail them, the people will come, that kind of thing. But across developed and developing countries, we're seeing that's absolutely not the case. So that even when we talk about markets that are truly saturated in terms of access to the internet, who has time to actually take an online course during a pandemic is gendered. Who has time to or who has the can actually have the wherewithal to share their political opinions without being trolled, takes a gendered perspective. So it's been really interesting over the last couple of years trying to really get folks to understand that that dimension does translate. And in fact, what the digital domain is doing is helping us understand that when we talk about something like gender divides, we shouldn't just assume it's a developmental issue or it's just a specific problem for developing countries. It's just one paradigm. But even those of us who are already connected, whether we are just cosmopolitan or from developed countries, these are the nuances that are shaping that. And also in the design of technologies, more specifically, one very good example is when Apple rolled out the Apple Watch to much fanfare a couple of years ago. In all their brilliance, they never considered that for folks who want to track their health, half the population will be women. And once one of the big things we worry about is tracking our sexual and reproductive health. So they didn't have any after all those years of hype and design, they didn't have any clearly women in the design team to help them think about that, and it had to be corrected. So you see a lot of that starting to normalize in the digital era. We've seen how the notion of voice assistance has been gendered as well, and we have to ask why is that? We've seen translation services or sort of automatic translation services assume that when you search doctor for certain languages, especially like if it's Latin languages, automatically ascribing that as a male. But if you look for a cleaner, if you search to translate a cleaner, the word cleaner, you will get female, those kinds of things. So all of these are layers and nuances around how these aspects that are being talked about, as if you will call them offline, are being encoded into this world we're moving forward towards. And so that's a really important dimension. It's been a very tricky thing to get folks to understand. And for the perspective of those who are here or more business oriented, it's a huge issue too. I mean, in how the private sector, be it in technology itself or in other sectors that are intersecting with technology, are organized to start addressing these issues. If you don't have more women in leadership, and not just leadership bodies in a room, but actually with power to change how things work, we end up with these kinds of situations. Lastly, the other perspective I've really started reflecting and writing and speaking about is, even as we talk about the economic potential that exists in trying to include women, we must not commodify women, so that we have a lot of narratives now that are making it sound like the only reason to correct this stuff is because women are good for the economy. I know, like, the McKinsey statistic is used a lot, but I'm like, I've worked on women's economic empowerment as a theme that was supposed to make sense for why we should have gender responsive systemic, reform, to Yasmin's and Doreen's work. But now we have a lot more of, women business models that are shaped to target women because they're good for the economy, and having a flip side, especially with digital. A good example there is lending platforms, and it's especially those that are trying to lend cash. They will target women because they know that women are loyal, right? You'll pay back. But the whole idea of targeting them, the business models are like, you will extract as much interest from these women. And we're ending up with perverse systems that are supposed to be empowering women through digital. And the ways that digital is empowering them is also tracking them, surveilling them, and so on and so forth. So those are the new risks now, once we get more people connected, that are happening. And so that's in a nutshell the crazy world of work for me as far as this topic goes, and as it intersects with tech.
Lots of work to be done there, but huge opportunities. And there must be so many, but we want to ask you, what is one of the opportunities in the digital world that you're most excited about, that it can directly be linked to advancing women's economic or maybe even political empowerment?
Where we are now, let me speak to what's actually already happening with just spaces like social media, despite the toxic space that it tends to be. Just seeing the conversations that have happened, especially those led by women across the world. And I love that, on some level, you're able to transcend boundaries, even though algorithms try to still bring us back to those. But over the years, looking at a platform like Twitter, for example, you just see how communities of women have reinforced each other's narratives. You can see women collectives in India talking about a nation, and you'll see Kenyan women's bringing their context, and you see African-American women when they wake up adding to that context, and so on and so forth, and building this notion that we're here, we're going to be seen, we're going to be heard. And what's been really powerful about it is also seeing how it helps change norms and these patriarchal sort of like conceptions that exist amongst both men and women. Right now in Kenya, we just had a moment yesterday where, for the first time in history, we might have a judiciary that is led by all women, because we just had a woman nominated to be the Chief Justice. Her deputy is a woman. The head of key judicial elements are women. But you see the tension between people saying, "But what does that mean for the judiciary?" The classic patriarchal tropes. But then those being not just flooded, but being rationalized to the fact that we will not die because men have been leading the country in other functions, and this is all right. So seeing those little narratives is a very important part, because then it translates to the world of work, it translates to the world of communities, it translates even to conversations men who have been on Twitter yapping at women have at home with their daughters and with their wives and with their sisters, right? And so sometimes we forget that those are the little things that make up for all these other systemic parts that we're trying to build, and really trying to cultivate a space where those continue to grow. More women can speak up, speak out, create new ways of thinking, new ways of doing that impact even those who are power holders. I think that's a really powerful moment to keep working towards.
Amazing. Wish we could talk a lot longer about all of this. But one thing I want to say to you, Manjira, and I'm sure you know this, there was this really famous paper done by Emily Oster, a Harvard economist, where she basically looked at the rollout of television in rural India. And she actually showed that basically having this exposure through television, which will be amplified through actually digital, where you can even choose with who you want to talk. But she showed that this directly is related to improved gender perceptions and norms. So in that case, like, as you know everything about, the opportunities are tremendous in so many different ways. Well, awesome. Well, let's go basically to the next topic, something you all really know a lot about, and that's actually stakeholder interaction. Because what we really know is that in order to really make interventions addressing the gender gap effective, but also make them sustainable and scale up, we need to work together across different stakeholders. One can't just do this by themselves. So we have a few questions for you. First of all, Doreen, in your work with One Acre Fund, you've really been working a lot with the Rwandan government very closely. What learnings can you share about building these relationships with the government partners?
Actually, Iris, before I respond to that question, I think there's a little bit of a caveat that I think is very important for me to share, which is that a lot of the issues that we're speaking about at One Acre Fund, I want to acknowledge that this is also just a learning experience for us. For many years, we were just focused on building a very impactful program, which we did. We've been able to scale quite rapidly. We've also found, we have actually evidence that shows that women within our program do have better outcomes than women who are not. But that was actually not always by design. So one of the cool things, and I'm really glad that Yasmin is here as well, that Impact has done is like really pushing us to think about how do we more intentionally incorporate that lens within our work. So as we go into this conversation with government, there are lots of opportunities for us, but also this is also just a moment of learning, especially as we zero down on what gender looks like within our systems change work. So I just wanted to put that there. We are definitely not experts. We're also just learning as we go. But to your question, One Acre Fund has built pretty strong relationships with the government across all of our countries of operation. I will perhaps highlight one where we really want to focus in a lot of our gender work. So currently here in Rwanda, we provide technical and financial support to the government's national extension system. And this is a network of about 14,000 farmer trainers. We call them farmer promoters, who are able to reach every village in the country. Currently, we support in creating training materials, and we've seconded 20 staff who also support the system with performance management. With the work that we've been doing with Impact, one initiative that we're trying to drive towards now is a joint nationwide gender transformation campaign that focuses both on positive gender norms around activities, but also distribution of benefits associated with key agricultural productivity factors by leveraging on these farmer trainers. Currently, this is a system of 14,000 extension agents, but only 20% are women. So one of the first things we want to do is push that number up to at least 50%. And we believe that that would have a sustained impact in two ways. One is increasing the number of women leading and training community members helps reinforce community views about who can represent the community and who can serve as a leader within a community. But two, we also see a sustained shift in how content in training is delivered. As an example, we're thinking of using, designing training so that they challenge gender norms by depicting women in traditionally male activities. So we already have a lot of the infrastructure there in the partnerships with the government, but what we're looking at now is how do we more systematically add that gender lens. And then there's also work to be done on the policy side. I would say in Rwanda is a bit more advanced in, having certain laws and regulations and protections for women, but there's still quite a lot of work that we want to do in taking everything from paper into practice.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Doreen. Yeah, it's really great that you actually managed to get this gender lens in, and you've made so much progress. And if I remember the stats right, the One Acre Fund started in 2006 with 36 pilot farmers and grew now to over 1 million beneficiaries. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
It's very impressive. Thank you. Nanjera, you have served on many high-level panels, such as the UN Secretary General's panel for women's economic empowerment and various other high-level advocacy programs etc. I won't go into all of them, but can you elaborate a little bit on what lessons you have learned on how to build a sense of urgency and inspire collaborators and partners to drive change?
Showing up is the most important one. And I mean showing up really with insights that defy the typical narratives. I mean, I think at this point with many initiatives, you have the right language. We want to do this, we want to do that. So it projects, positivity as if the world will be fixed tomorrow if we all just step outside and kumbaya. But really showing up for how those are actually accounted for has been really important. So that, having even served on a panel like Women's Economic Empowerment, one of the most humbling things for me was realizing, given how many different stakeholders, and in this case, the interest by business communities, right, from multinationals to national level ones, who subjectively understanding it was really scary. I mean, you've worked on a narrative for so long, like I was saying, with the numbers and why it's great, but then you end up with business models that are exploiting women. And then you come back to these communities and you're finding that, this thing that was supposed to help them has just got them caught up in some unfortunate, unempowering situations. So who's empowered in that sense is a big corporation. Those are really important trends. And I'm really focusing on the whole idea of business because I know this is a more business school type of conversation. And I don't want folks to think these are just issues that happen out there in the development cycle. It very much happens in the business aspect of it. So really also challenging, when actors like business communities and private sector actors talk about responsible business practices, to really account for the fact that it might necessarily mean not pursuing a particular model if at the end we've mapped that it's going to be exploitative. And this applies in both technology and even in just like getting more women into the digital economy or any other economy. And challenging that to be like, are you morally prepared to say that you would step, if it's the responsible thing to do, would you step away from this practice if it's being shown that it's not just harming women, but it's harming communities? And when you harm women, you're harming their communities. Would you be able, do we have the moral fortitude amongst actors to stop something because they have that much power to be able to go in? So for me, these have been the more important trends over and above the narratives that are typically put out there, and really unpacking them. The joke is usually I'm the chief unfun officer because I'll go for that. And I'm like, we have to future-proof it. Otherwise, we'll always be hurrying up and waiting or creating these systems that are always just harming people. And the world already has so many harms. Getting those who are supposed to be supported by these things, getting cynical about who's doing this and not. It's a road to nowhere. So that for me has been the most important lesson, going beyond the surface level narratives and really unpacking what it actually means when we say these are the responsibilities, these are the goals. It sounds nice on paper, but what does it look like in practice? Fleshing those out is really, really important.
Wow, yeah, amazing. I totally agree. That's really interesting. Can you also say a little bit more about how multilateral organizations like the United Nations can actually help to hold accountability throughout the global economic systems and actually drive and push other organizations also to think more about the gender elements?
Mm-hmm. So the multilateral systems have been useful as conveners. And I think what they've done, especially over the past decade or so, is really drawing in the multinationals and private sector communities into spaces where they can convene with governments who are member states, typically of like UN systems, and increasingly incorporating not-for-profit actors to also bring their perspectives to it. Now, they do need to go beyond having great principles like the UN Principles on Business and Human Rights and the UN Global Compact, which would be perhaps the most relevant multilateral instruments for private sector players, to really finding ways to hold them accountable. It's one thing to sign up and sort of have a signaling that, you're a member of this compact or you sign up to this principle, but how do you account for how you actually enforce them on the ground, if you will? How, if we look, for example, at any company that has signed up to the business and human rights principles of the Global Compact, can we find the diversity of leadership in the workforce? Can we actually go and find the report on that? Because that would be the easiest accountability measure. Are you walking the talk internally? And then over and above that, how are you walking the talk in terms of the work that you've set out to do? So that's where the UN system should find the fortitude to do a lot more of that, because they've already done a good job with convening and gotten a lot of people to be drawn to that. Now they need to flesh out and eke out a bit more of, and perhaps in partnership with, not-for-profit sector or other stakeholders, and especially communities, to develop these mechanisms and then get these folks to account for what they're saying through actions.
Thank you so much, Nigeria. Very interesting again. Last, Yasmin, you provide a little bit of a different angle. You work also closer with donors. As Go-Impact defines itself as a collaborative, really like linking local or like very effective enterprises or initiatives with funders. But as a funder, you might be a step removed from really thinking about gender divide, in particularly sometimes in the middle income countries, if they're focused, say, in the US where you are based. So how do you ensure that you or donor organizations effectively engage in communities and ensure that really what the interventions are really addressing the needs of women?
Absolutely. First, we are completely step away, or more than a step away, from the real work that happens, right? And the important thing to realize is, as funders, there is a power dynamic. You are bringing financial resources, and so you have to be really cognizant of that. And what we do, and we hope we do it well, but Doreen's would give us the reality check there, is to say the partner, we don't call them grantees, we call them program partners, are in the driver's seat. They know the context. As Doreen said, you know the context, you understand the problems, you understand what is driving some of the issues at the ground level, and you know what needs to be done, because it takes a political economy understanding, right? As I said, it's not technocratic solutions alone that are going to solve these intractable social problems. It's going to be a deep-rooted political economy and a power analysis that is going to shift it. So for us, it's about our partners. We go through a rigorous diligence process, but when we select our partners. But Nigeria has been saying something that I want to come back to, because this is such an important distinction. So world over, we have programs for women and girls. I can't, every single program, right? Women and girls are the target audience. They're a passive target audience. They're a marginalized target audience. And they're an audience that feels like they need help. And that's how we've positioned it. There are now increasingly programs that are saying, and where you got us started, Iris, is let's look at structural barriers, right? And this is where some of the work comes in. But actually, what it needs to come down to is who's in charge and who's making decisions. The programs that challenge status quo, the programs that are willing to take on the rules of the game, because there are formal and informal. If we look at women in leadership, we did an evidence review. And what do we have as a solution to have more women in leadership today? We have training programs. Let's build their capacity. Like, the problem is an individualistic problem. The problem is systemic, right? The women, when they enter these institutions, there are old schoolboy networks, there are formal and informal networking and mentoring pathways that are keeping women out. So we put the onus of change on the individual woman and improve her skills to do presentation and business plans, when actually the problem is the culture that doesn't give her time out, and there isn't a system for childcare in this country. And we make it sound like it's an individual choice. So it's about changing that status quo. And I think funders need to come in and start funding that. And that's an uncomfortable space to be, because you have to start with your own power. So to give you an example, globally, we look at funding, less than 10% of the funding, and I'm being generous here with the 10%, goes to women-led organizations. We said last year, we did an open call, and we said, actually, at least 50% of our funding will go to women-led, 100% Global South, right? So there will be only Global South, no international organization, 50%. We got over 600 applications across health, education, economic opportunity, across all three continents where we work. And we saw that there are these opportunities. The problem then, people say, well, they don't have absorptive capacity. Of course, you've been starving someone, now you want them to run a half marathon. So let's actually build the capacity, challenge our own assumptions. And that's what we are trying to do as a funder through our program partners.
That's really amazing and really encouraging to see that you got so many, 600 fantastic applications. And also to bridge this a little bit to the question that we had with Doreen, and Doreen elaborated to it. also sometimes, for example, in leadership, governments can also play a role. Like in India, for example, where you have the female pradhan, which is a village leader, you have a rotating system that one third of the villages needs to have a female pradhan, and this rotates, actually making sure that every village at some point is exposed to female leadership, and this is mandatory. So I know it's not a question, but I mean, I'd like to hear a little bit whether you think that is a way we should think about as well. But also what I really would like to ask is, across the whole development community, what progress are you seeing in organizations making commitments to gender inclusive development? And are you encouraged? I think you are, given your last response, but.
So first, you mentioned the Panchayat Raj reform that happened in India, right, where 30% of the village leaders had to be women. There is a really nice paper, several actually, by Esther Duflo and her colleagues, which have looked at the impact of that. And it did a couple of things. One, the number of women leaders, even though it was a rotating system, overall went up. So it wasn't just something mandatory that slid back. Second, it changed villages' perceptions about what women leaders are. You can believe what you see, right? And this is the problem, from young girls to also men. You're not seeing enough women leaders. And when you see them, it becomes the norm. And to your point, which is the last one, because we should make sure it's not instrumental, right? To what Nanjira was saying, we saw better investment in child education, overall public works programs in those communities. So it was an experiment that worked. It was a quota system. And again, if you look at evidence reviews, if you package quota systems with the changes that have to happen institutionally, not individually, you do see, a course correction is required for women's leadership. So I just wanted to support that point you were making. Whether I'm encouraged or not, I think we should take both perspectives, right? I think we should say it's been 25 years since the Beijing Declaration, and are we satisfied with the progress? And the answer has to be a resounding no if it's going to take 136 years for us to get there. That is unacceptable. It's half the population. People aren't living fulfilling lives, whether that leads to economic prosperity or not. I know it's a blasphemous thing to do with this audience, but the most important thing is a rights-based approach, and we're far from it. On the other hand, I am encouraged. Yes, that is fantastic work. Look at this panel today. The kind of work Doreen and her organization and what Nanjira is leading. These conversations are happening. Technology has opened up the world. So I am very, very positive about the commitments. I just want us to keep challenging the status quo, because making improvements at the edges is not what is needed. Right now, what we need is completely restructuring the system. For the men in the audience who are wondering what this means, it's creating a level playing ground. So it can look like your side is going down. It's not actually. It's just staying steady. We're just lifting the other side for a little bit of an equal platform here, because there's a tremendous amount of backlash that happens when we say things like gender equality, feminism. It's seen as a limited pie, and it's not.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Thank you all for your answer. It's really interesting. Both of you have very broad experience. You also have your own levels of very deep experience. But what we see is there are a lot of overlapping elements that will actually come back. And I think in the end, what all three of you mentioned is the same. We need systematic change, and this needs to happen at different levels. We can't just focus on one thing. It needs to be an inclusive intervention addressing that. That means understanding the context, addressing not only women, also men, impacting multiple stages of their lives, and including multiple stakeholders. This is great, but it might be sometimes also a bit overwhelming, particularly for students. They might think, this is very interesting, I'm very passionate about it, but how do I start working in this domain? And that's actually where we're do you have any advice, for example, on how to find a job in the gender impact atmosphere, or potentially personal lifestyle advice? So I'd like to start with you, Nanjira. Do you have any advice for us?
Oh man, I think, really it's first be
own your convictions. I think, and I'm speaking on this based on the fact that I can't say there was any career advice I got that got me here. I sort of was just very loud and proud and claimed whatever space there was, and obviously kept the door open where I could to make sure that it's not closed behind me. What will typically happen is sometimes if it seems like you're a very good advocate for something, the system as the status quo as is can really create an environment that makes it look like you're the chosen one, right? And then it'll create an opportunity to sort of enclose you while in a way which can be isolating. So sometimes it might even necessarily mean knowing when to say no to the coolest looking sounding gig, because at the end of the day, it could make you what for women specifically, I like to say the patriarchy princess, where your work has then been co-opted to maintain the status quo as opposed to actually giving you the lever to keep that door open and change things. It's just as important to look out for as opportunities to look out too. Now with the what the pandemic may or may not have done for the world of work remains to be seen. And sometimes I do worry that it might, people might go back to what seemed like was working, and that's not the system, the revolution we're going for. So speaking up and speaking out against it, I love seeing so many, there's a community out there through these spaces, online spaces. Join those, learn through those, and find that, you might find the fortitude and the language to speak up and speak out, even in an interview where you must tell them respectfully, you must rearrange this gig. It's not the way the world should work. And I think that's how we start changing the little things that change norms and change systems. So I know it sounds like a lot more of what not to do, but I think that's how sometimes it looks like. I mean, in my experience, it's all really coming from the outside in, coming outside as a woman, as a young woman in a developing country, trying to go into work in my own country, working globally and being boxed, right? So I know I come at it more from telling everyone, breaking down those barriers and complicating those equations. So it's still valuable. And hopefully one day we can sit there and say it can be an objective mechanism, how you can go from passion to purpose through work. Until then, we have to build that space together.
Very, very impactful. Say no to certain opportunities if you know they may backlash. Thank you. Yasmin, what is your advice?
So humbly, first, my background is very similar to a lot of your audience. I've done an MBA. I spent 20 years in health because when I was working in the private sector in marketing and brand management, I thought there was more to life than market share and profits. And so I moved to development because they were looking for business skills. So I used my skills to sell and distribute condoms, to sell toilets, to have franchise clinics where you could get reproductive health services. And so I think increasingly there is business skills and there's business purpose. And I think business skills are relevant no matter what it is. The purpose is what Nanjira is saying, right? Find your purpose to it. So that's one. I think the second is the world has become a really small place. So my strong advice is don't follow a career path, get as many experiences in as many parts of the world as you can, because living in different societies opens your eyes. This point I make about it's not about the individual, it's about the systems, was really eye-opening for me when I moved to the US. It's not like the Americans are better drivers than Indians are. The traffic system in India is bad, right? And we put the onus on the individual. And it really changed my mind that if you work in a different system, you can be a different person. And I think there's nothing that's going to replace that except just getting the experience. So that's what I would say. Use your skills and get as many experiences as possible. There's no such thing as a career track anymore, I think. So last advice is don't follow my advice, actually.
I've just heard something in Yasmin's point that I really wanted to emphasize for especially our friends when you're coming from sort of like the global north to the global south. Read as much as possible about how not to do it. There's so much literature out there about tropes that we need to undo and unlearn. And humility. Humility, especially if you're going to go looking for experiences in different parts of the world, is the most important thing. So read up so much. I mean, somebody loves to say the Western archive as we know it is dead, and it's true. There's so much to learn from the rest of the world too, around these perspectives and how we see the world from this side. So get as much literature about it as possible, or as many Twitter threads.
So many things to say, but we're running out of time. One thing I do want to say, and I know this, I just want to say this because Wheeler, our partner institution, is really, Yasmin, on your first element, what you said, is really business skills and business school can really go hand in hand with development, because there's a lot of skills and theories that actually perfectly, switch to the development domain, particularly, for example, healthcare, supply systems, etc. But enough about that. Doreen, we'd like to hear your advice.
I think for me, when I was thinking about that, I actually thought about everyone who's on this call. We all wield an insane amount of privilege. Being a woman, especially being a Black woman, obviously you enter certain spaces and you're told that you are at a disadvantage. But even then, I am making a very broad assumption here, not knowing everyone who's on this call, but I would say just think about how you use that privilege within your spheres of influence. Because when you talk about the issue of gender, it seems so big and so insurmountable, and it's difficult to really pinpoint where do you start and what do you start with. But within, like the teams you manage and people who report to you, within the industries or the sectors you're in, there are typically a lot of layers of people beneath you that don't have the type of privilege that you have, that don't have the type of voice that you have, within decision making. That don't have the type of access that you might have. So thinking about how you use the privilege that you have, both for men and women, to really champion, changes in outcomes for women. And sometimes it's smaller changes, whether it's connecting women to other women leaders for mentorship opportunities, or creating affinity groups that help women respond to challenges in areas where they're not being heard. But I think the last thing I will say for me, my biggest piece of learning working with Core Impact over the past year was double click the assumptions on your data. We have, I would say, Waneka Fund has pretty good impact data on, our impact over the last decade or so, but it's not until recent when we double clicked on that and decided to disaggregate that to look at, to question what type of impact we were having on women farmers, what experience they were having within our program. And something as simple as, the way we are scaling technology today, we've had to revisit that. And that's something that would not have happened if we were not disaggregating both, our assumptions, but also our impact. So those would be my biggest takeaways.
Thank you, Doreen. I know we're almost out of time, but there are a few questions, so let's go into them. First question is for you, Yasmin. What is being done or can be done to address the mindset issue? So the generations that have been conditioned to see the gender divide in different areas as the norm, and get them to start advocating for change and transmitting the right values to their community for long-lasting impact. The question was for Yasmin, but Doreen and Nigeria, please jump in as well.
So I think the question is at the root of it, right? It's asking about norms in society. And I think norms are both inputs and outputs. So if you're tackling the kind of problems, when Doreen is talking about the research they did with women farmers, it came down to norms around decision-making within the household, what crops to grow, who goes to the market, who collects the cash, who uses the cash. And it came down to norms around land use, right? And so you have to tackle some of those directly on an issue based, and the gender transformative campaign that Doreen was talking about. But norms are also the outcomes. The paper that I'm talking about in India, when changes happen, norms shift over time. And I think being able to track that, but putting at the heart for all of those who've talked about women's economic empowerment, we can sometimes see that as increased income or increased resilient income or entry into workforce. Actually, it should be measured in terms of power and agency. And there are now increasing outcomes to measure agency. And if you have economic outcomes without agency, you've not achieved anything. So I think it comes down to some of those, but I would love to hear from the other panelists.
Nigeria, do you want to go first?
Not at the risk. I think Yasmin has covered it pretty well. And obviously you can have a whole other session even around evaluating what success looks like, right? One tool I've tried to use in my work, especially at the intersection of gender responsive ICT policies, was actually working with the policymakers, not just on the technical issues, but starting the sessions with unpacking the perceptions on gender, because you don't realize how much even power holders have not challenged their gender assumptions. You can stand on the stage with everyone and say how much you believe in equality, but really in the heart of hearts and how it affects the work that you do is something that we often don't understand. So working with power holders has been really a powerful way I've seen to give them a safe space to unpack their assumptions. We've all been victims of the patriarchy, really, and it doesn't work for most of us, including men. So creating spaces that help start and shedding light to that. And, hearing, people who are head of technical departments in ICT ministries, for example, understanding that it is gendered how you think about rolling out infrastructure. Because if you just follow a particular path, what if it's not the safe path for a woman to walk, even if it's to her home or to the market or elsewhere? Helping them understand that, I think, was a very powerful way to start making sense of what we mean by language like gender responsive ICT policy. So it's really going into, and again, it's really unpacking what we have from the meta level into the ways of working across different sectors. It takes time. There's also room to experiment with intergenerational teams of experts working on these issues. There's so much really that you can get creative with. And hopefully you can have mechanisms of support, whether it's funders in the philanthropic sector or private sector CSR actors who will be willing to understand that this is the way we go towards realizing all these things we have on this meta level.
Amazing.
Just one small thing to add to that, as you were speaking, Nigeria, I believe it was around 2018, the Ministry of Agriculture in Rwanda produced a gender mainstreaming strategy. And it was actually interesting when we approached them and said, well, what does this actually mean in practical terms? Can you define that? And a lot of the people who had actually spent time working on the strategy could not really articulate what that means for the women, women farmers that are supposed to be impacted by that. So I thought that it was important that you highlighted that.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, Doreen, and Nigeria. Unfortunately, we're out of time. There were more questions as always, but thank you so much for joining us. Everyone who joined us, thank you so much. I would like to remind you that later today, I believe at 5 p.m., there's another Wheeler Institute event with Gita Gonipath and Elias, and it's a webinar which is part of the series Rethinking Capitalism event. So if you want to join, that's later today. But for now, I'd like to just once again thank all three of you. It was really wonderful talking to you. I wish we had another hour, but we'll ask Jess and Rob maybe to just organize a new one. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.